Hello, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you enjoy this conversation on Trendlines, you can get more of WPR's news and analysis directly in your inbox by registering for our free daily newsletter. You'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. On Tuesday of this week, the United Kingdom recorded more than 7,000 new coronavirus cases and 71 fatalities. That's the country's highest single daily number of new cases yet, and its biggest one-day death toll since July. It's all part of an ongoing COVID-19 resurgence that Britain has been experiencing since early September. In response, Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government has tightened lockdown measures in hard-hit parts of the country. In northeast England, people could be fined up to £6,400, or roughly $8,200, just for meeting with people from outside their households in an indoor space. Joining me now to discuss these developments is Tom McTague. He's a staff writer for The Atlantic based in London, where he's been reporting on the UK's coronavirus response. Tom, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I mentioned some of the really sad recent statistics in my introduction. You and I are speaking on Wednesday. By the time this interview goes live, there might have been even more records set based on how things are going. But just based on what you've been observing and writing about from London, are you surprised to see the country hit so hard by the second wave?
I'm not surprised that the wave is growing. It's, from all of the research and everything that we've been told and briefed right from the beginning of this crisis, everyone always said that the problem with these pandemics is its exponential growth. So if you don't get hold of it very, very early on, it just starts to grow, and it grows. It grows relentlessly. What I'm slightly surprised about is the speed at which we've gone from seeming to be in control of it over the summer, and the idea that as a country, the government may have learnt the lessons of its mistakes. In the first wave, where the UK suffered the highest death toll in Europe, that it would have learnt those lessons and got on top of it more quickly. Now, that doesn't appear to have happened, and right now it looks like the UK is following the same trend as France and Spain and other countries on the continent, which seem to have lost control again.
For the piece that you wrote for The Atlantic that came out in August, you spoke with one expert, Mark Walport, who sits on the government Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE, and he said that many of the challenges the UK has had are not really about policy advice or science advice. Instead, they're, quote, questions about resilience. What did he mean by that exactly?
His comment got really to the heart of a question that's been troubling people in the UK, which is that from afar, a lot of people have concluded that Britain elected a populist government and a populist leader. Boris Johnson is seen as somebody, a kind of Trump light, a Britain Trump, as Donald Trump said. Now, while that's never really been true, in many respects, Boris Johnson is a liberal conservative. He'd certainly be a very liberal conservative in the United States. But it got to the heart of something, which was he took the advice of his experts. He wasn't flouting advice. This was an expert-led strategy from the start, and it didn't work. So then you were forced to really confront some difficult questions, which is Britain thought it had really good science sector, really good scientists, world-leading academia, expertise, structures of government, all of these things Britain prided itself on, and whatever else was happening in the world, whatever else was happening with Brexit and other mistakes, if you consider Brexit a mistake, other big policy shifts like that, it felt secure in some of its institutions. And what the pandemic did is it put a giant question mark over those institutions, and it made people question some of the really basic things that it had taken for granted, such as its National Health Service, or its civil service, or its Foreign Office, or its Home Office. all of these things started to come under question. So what Dr. Walport was saying was, look, do we have an institutional problem here, a systemic problem, where we actually we can do certain things, but whenever something else happens out of the blue, actually the institutions that we have can't cope because they're not as strong as we thought they were.
The National Health Service has always been interesting to me, and I think for a lot of American observers of the UK as well, just because the UK has this image as a country that shares a lot of the traditional sort of liberal in the classical sense approach to economic policy as in the US, very laissez-faire, hands-off, privatized system that's been in place probably since Thatcher. And yet you still have the NHS, which is like this huge public institution that remains very popular. And as you wrote in your article, the NHS actually responded quite well to the pandemic. It rose to meet the occasion. So what was it about the NHS or the way the NHS has been treated in recent years that made it so problematic?
Well, I think what happened was the NHS runs as an efficient service because it is entirely funded through taxpayers' money. So that seems like a contradiction, right? You know, we usually think of big public sector organizations like the NHS as being wasteful, and there is clearly a lot of waste in the NHS. But what it does is there is this enormous constant pressure to get as much value from the NHS as possible because the government is spending taxpayers' money on it. So it always runs very, very close to capacity. There is not a lot of money that's spent that can be spent on just spare capacity, on insurance in a way. It is constantly working near full tilt. There aren't lots of beds available all the time. There are bodies that monitor, the efficiency of public spending, what drugs can be bought and supplied by the NHS. There are formulas, controversial formulas that say if a drug does not provide this much value, and that is valued in extra life years gained per pound that is spent on these drugs, then they can't be sanctioned for the NHS. So there is this tight control of it, and that has benefits, in that it allows money to be spent on other things in the economy. But when a pandemic hit, the NHS was full, and it was struggling already because we'd gone through 10 years of austerity, essentially, since the 2008 financial crash, which hit Britain very, very hard because of the size of its financial sector. So essentially, the NHS went into this emergency mode where it had to clear out wards across the country to prepare for the wave that it knew it was coming. So you had to take radical steps. Now, again, this gets to the heart of the British experience, the sort of unique British experience, which is it has this command and control National Health Service where the government and the leaders of the NHS can just order wards to be cleared, beds to be cleared, patients not to be allowed into hospitals, to stay at home other than in extreme emergencies. And that's what happened. And that meant that the health service wasn't overwhelmed in a way that you saw in northern Italy and to some extent, I think, in parts of New York. That didn't happen in the UK. However, that came with a huge cost in that you can't make such dramatic interventions into national life without unintended consequences. And some of the unintended consequences we're only really just discovering now. They are things like much higher deaths at home, older people not ringing up, not going into hospital for things that turn into very, very serious problems. And then a dramatic example was older people were taken out of hospital without tests to see if they had COVID, and they were put back into the care homes which they'd come from, retirement homes, but for the end of life retirement homes, and they were the most deadly places to see the disease. So the disease got into the care homes partly because of the pressure to protect the NHS, And from that moment, uh, the government lost control of the disease in care homes, and it killed thousands of people at the end of their life, the most vulnerable people in Britain. So you had these competing experiences. You had some success, in quotes, about protecting the NHS, but now people are saying, well, we shouldn't necessarily be protecting the NHS. The NHS should be protecting us.
Do you have a sense that this will lead to maybe changes in the way the NHS operates, just to not have it be at such full capacity and not have its resources so tightly controlled, as you were saying?
It's a very hard situation though, because ultimately Britain, like every other country in the world, is suffering from a major, historic recession right now because of the pandemic, which means that the government is taking on huge extra borrowing from an already high position. After uh, only just recovering from the great financial crisis. So there isn't a lot of money to be spent. Boris Johnson's one of his core campaign pledges was that he would bring an end to the austerity that had typified the last Conservative government under David Cameron and then Theresa May. So he has set himself against austerity. So he can't go and ask for a lot more money for the country from the country. On one hand, to pay off the debts that it has accrued during the pandemic, and then to start funding the NHS. But on the other hand, you've had this mass wave of support for the NHS through this crisis. It's become a kind of beacon for which the country is able to sort of look up to and to a certain extent rally around. So you have signs and placards in people's doors and on on footballers' shirts and on motorway. Placards and things like that saying "Thank you, NHS." So you've got these. The government is in a really tight place. It has to try and find more money for the NHS, but there isn't much money around.
There was another really fascinating quote from your piece that I wanted to ask you about. One British official told you that, quote, "It's obvious that the British state was not prepared for the pandemic, but even worse, many parts of the state thought they were prepared, which is significantly more dangerous." Maybe you could expand on that and talk a bit more about it, because I thought it was a really interesting admission for someone in government to make.
Yes, so when you strip away a lot of the layers of this story, you do get to that fundamental point, which is that Britain feels like, or it's the way Britain looks at itself. It has, like any other nation, it has these crises of confidence about certain aspects of its character and its achievement, but it also has things that it believes that it is good at or world class at. And Britain has various institutions around which it builds this sort of level of trust and pride. And over the last decade or so, perhaps 20 years, a lot of these institutions have suffered some kind of scandal or question marks over their capability. So you have pressure, for example, on the BBC at the moment, which used to be, the great British media organisation that people thought of as the gold standard. You might have question marks over the NHS as well. There have been scandals in the NHS about care. So that's gnawed away at people's sense of pride. The military being bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, and some of the behaviour of British soldiers has been revealed and has caused people to question things like that. So you've had this succession of crises, and Parliament too has been affected by this. But there were still elements of the British state that people thought were extremely good. So people would often say that the civil service in Britain was the best in the world because it was neutral. It guarded its neutrality. Sort of fiercely, and it believed in it, and it had an ethos. And the Foreign Office and the diplomatic service were considered very good. the intelligence agencies, MI6, um, had believed in its own reputation as able to compete with the Americans, if not for money, but at least for uh, its effectiveness. So you had these institutions that people believed in, and coming back to it, the scientists, the great science sector. People would say that the British science industry was the best in the world, with around Cambridge University and Oxford University, and there's a certain pride about, are we going to be the first country to find the vaccine? So when the pandemic hits and Britain feels like, well, at least we've got this covered. At least when something like this happens, of course, we'll do well compared to other countries which can't have as good a science sector or civil service or functioning state as we do. At least we've got that. And actually, that proved not to be the case, that we demonstrably didn't perform better than other countries. Now, there may be lots and lots of reasons for that: population density, the size and scale and of London, the fact that we've got this giant hub airport where people come in and out of all the time, the biggest in Europe. Maybe all of these things contributed, but ultimately there is a recognition that the state didn't perform as well as other states in the European Union, France or the Netherlands or Spain or Italy, and clearly it didn't perform as well as Germany. So the problem here is Britain thought it was prepared, it thought it would be good in a crisis like this, and it wasn't.
How much of the blame for that needs to be laid at the feet of Boris Johnson?
Well, I think in the reporting that I did, it's clear that Boris Johnson made mistakes, and he took decisions that, in hindsight, have proved not as good as decisions made by other leaders around the world. Whether that's the most obvious case of Angela Merkel, who I think made quite early decisions to enforce a shutdown in Berlin, or at least was supportive of them. But ultimately, it's not really a case of, is this Boris Johnson's fault or not? What he ultimately did was he decided to follow the advice of his chief medical officer and his chief scientific officer, who had an entirely cogent, reasonable strategy to deal with the pandemic that was overtaken by the speed of the assault and the wave and the scale of the wave, and they got it wrong, and they're trying to correct for that today by moving more quickly to get on top of the second wave. But ultimately, I think most of the people I spoke to, at least, said that to focus too much on Boris Johnson is to miss the wider story, which is of systemic failure. And it also then it sort of lets him off this time round as well with the second wave. Now, if Britain is affected by a second wave just as much as a first wave, or suffers the worst second wave in Europe again, then I think the question marks would be on Boris Johnson much more obviously that time, because he would not have learned from the lessons of the first wave.
The UK has also been hardest hit economically among developed countries by the pandemic. I believe among OECD countries, it had the worst contraction in the second quarter of this year of any member of the OECD. So where does that leave the government in terms of the lack of resources that you mentioned, the lack of funds available to really cushion the damage?
Well, this again gets to the heart of some misconceptions about Britain, often that you hear just as much in Europe as you do in the United States, that Britain is a, in quotes, sort of Anglo-Saxon economy that's similar to the US. It's actually, it's much more European in its outlook economically, and as well in its response to the pandemic. It has essentially followed a European model. So if you have a look at the economic response, essentially Britain nationalized wages. This was a conservative government who paid the way 80% of the wages of employees who were furloughed. So it was an extraordinary economic bailout from the government, who, took over large swathes of the private economy and kept it afloat. And you're seeing a sort of tapering of that support now as it tries to sort of wean itself off that level of government intervention. So it really was an extraordinary government bailout that is continuing. But one of the other things that the UK suffers from compared to other European economies is that for much of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, Britain was outperforming large swathes of Western Europe. Far outperforming France and Spain and Italy. Over the last decade or so, Germany has obviously far outperformed Britain. But for a long time, Britain was doing well, and that was largely because it was one of the most open sort of ports in Europe. It was almost like a port for Europe into the world, and for the world into Europe for the service sector economy. So it was the financial sector in London, and the legal sector, and accountancy, and pharmaceuticals, and stuff like that. Whereas Germany was the major industrial manufacturing hub. But that leaves Britain particularly vulnerable in a moment like this, where it is so reliant on its service economy that is so vulnerable when you have to shut down. So Britain really suffered, and again, it comes down to a systemic weakness that's not necessarily its fault. It's a service sector economy, so it's going to be hit harder. But then it has the potential, perhaps, to bounce back more quickly if it can solve its problems. Now, that is a big if.
The degree to which the Conservative-led government has relied on these big government spending measures, as you mentioned, kind of makes me wonder how much oxygen that's taking away from the Labour Party and from the opposition movement to try to make a case as to where the government is failing, given that they're the party traditionally of more government spending.
Yes, there was there started to be some criticism that Britain only has one party. It's the lockdown party. Both parties support a lockdown of the economy and society to protect from a second wave, a second COVID wave. They both support massive state intervention to support people's wages and family incomes, to protect them through the lockdown, because essentially people have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. Viable businesses can't work because they've been told that their customers can't go into their stores and their restaurants. So, there is a lot of logic to what the government has done, and the support that it's had from the Labour Party. Now, I think actually in the polls there is huge support for the measures taken, and actually the Labour Party, rather than losing oxygen, has now crept ahead of the Conservative Party for the first time in a long time, and its leader Keir Starmer is polling higher than Boris Johnson. It's still tight, but the Labour Party has not had a leader who's polled above the Conservative leader in a long, long time. Jeremy Corbyn was last saw this, I think, in 2017 at the height of his popularity, but that had collapsed by 2019 when he lost to Boris Johnson. So the Labour Party is not challenging the government as much as some of its more radical supporters on the left would hope for, but it seems to be winning over a significant portion of Middle England.
For a while there, amid this fierce economic storm that's sweeping over the UK, it looked like COVID-19 might throw a wrench in the negotiations between the UK and the EU over the agreement that'll determine the shape of their post-Brexit trading relationship. I remember the UK's chief negotiator and the EU's chief negotiator both came down with coronavirus at one point. Would you say that's still a concern, or has the Johnson government managed to kind of muck things up there with no help from the pandemic?
We're right on the cusp of finding out what's going to happen with Brexit. It has until the end of the year to sign or come to some kind of trade agreement, or the Britain will end up trading with the European Union on just basic World Trade Organization terms. Essentially like any other country that doesn't have a trade deal with the EU. So right now, it's currently trading on a sort of standstill agreement, as if it was a member of the EU, even though it's left. And this is the so-called transition period.
And that ends at the end of December, right?
That ends at the end of December, December 31st. I think it's 11 p.m. On the 31st in the UK, which is obviously New Year on the continent. So this is the crunch moment, and what you're seeing is there is some optimism that a compromise can be found so that you don't have such enormous disruption overnight at New Year. But actually, strip everything away, and what you get to is whether you have a deal or not, you're actually talking about a very thin trade deal. Nothing like EU membership, where it is membership of a single European market with the same rules and regulations agreed in Brussels. What you're seeing here is not a major big trade deal with that covers everything, and certainly as well, it won't cover important other issues such as security cooperation and there is serious question marks about data protection and things like that really underpin a lot of business interaction. So whatever happens, whether there's a deal or there's not a deal, the Johnson government has made a decision that Brexit fundamentally means control over your laws and the ability to diverge from the European Union. If you can't diverge, in their view, what's the point of Brexit? That is the entire point. It's to do things differently. And they also believe that at the heart of the Brexit theory is that you can become more competitive if you have control over your laws. So certain industries that Britain has an advantage in, financial sector or emerging tech sector, or even pharmaceuticals, it hopes to be able to get a more benign regulatory environment in which it could thrive. Now, the EU obviously sees that as a threat, as a problem, and it's seeking to try to control that threat. So it has made quite significant demands that Britain agrees to level playing field obligations. It cannot intervene with state aid for its industries, and it has to agree binding rules that will be interpreted by the European Union's court. So really quite big things. So you've got at the heart of it not a technical argument, but a philosophical argument, a question of fundamentals. And this is why it's so difficult to overcome. So at some point, there is going to be a lot of disruption in the trading relationship between Britain and the European Union. You will see big tailbacks of lorries, trucks trying to get to the main port between Britain and France, Dover-Calais route, where so much of the trade goes through. So you're going to see huge disruption. And essentially, it's a gamble by Britain that it will be worth it in the long run. Essentially, we'll never know.
I want to ask you also about the critical question of Ireland. To avoid having a land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the UK has agreed, as part of its Brexit treaty with the EU, to essentially treat the Irish Sea as the customs boundary between the UK and Ireland, meaning British goods that are bound for Ireland get checked in Northern Ireland, which is still part of the UK. There's now a bill working through the British Parliament to reinterpret that agreement. How has the EU responded to that?
The EU responded with sort of outright fury to that because it, on the face of it, or the government admitted that it broke international law if it did this. And the international law is the treaty that Britain signed with the European Union to leave the European Union, setting the terms of the divorce, essentially. The European Union made a demand that in the divorce treaty to leave, now you don't have to sign a divorce treaty to leave the European Union. You can just leave. You can just say, I'm leaving, and you trigger what was called Article 50 of the European Union treaties, which is a 2-year countdown clock to leave the European Union. And in that 2 years, you're supposed to settle all your differences and sort of, okay, we owe you this much money and, you owe us this. It's essentially sort of what you do with the kids in a divorce relationship. Now, as part of that, Britain and the European Union signed an agreement to settle all that, and that's the treaty. And the treaty included this provision on Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, that it would, as you say, treat the sea border between the island of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which is on the island of Ireland. It would treat that almost as a sort of the economic border. And that meant that it didn't have to check goods between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So it didn't have to create a land border there, which would have been problematic for those people who live on either side of that border who consider themselves Irish, not British. So that's essentially the sort of fundamental problem. And when you come back to the future relationship, the future trading relationship, which is what is now being negotiated, the harder that break is, the sort of the weaker the trade deal, the more checks you have to do on the border. So there's your problem. If you imagine the United States erecting a trade border within the country, you could probably see how it might be controversial. And Northern Ireland will have to apply certain EU laws even after the UK has left the European Union.
It might not be as controversial here. I'm sure there are plenty of Republicans who would love to sanction California, for instance.
Yeah, but maybe not Texas or
no, probably not.
Or North Carolina. I guess. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, there's this sort of if you go back, you wind the clock back. Theresa May said that no British prime minister, could accept such a scenario. Because it essentially divides the one single sovereign territory. And keeps somebody else's laws applying in one bit of your territory. So you lose a certain element of control over your territory. Now, that is what the bill that you mentioned that's going through Parliament has sought to rectify. It sought to say, okay, we believe that the European Union is being unreasonable at asking too many checks to take place on this border that we've agreed to erect within our own country for the greater good. So therefore, we are going to press the nuclear button and say we're not going to agree to it at all. We're not going to abide by the word of what we said we would only a few months ago. And this is just risks poisoning the relationship between the UK and the EU sort of irreparably. Because how do you move on from that? How do you sign the next deal? How do you ensure that one will either side will stick to its obligation?
It's essentially the UK government admitting that its word is not to be trusted.
Yes, I mean the UK government's argument though is that the EU has not in legal terms, but in sort of practical terms, is overreaching on the deal that was signed, and it is being so unreasonable that it is a threat beyond which it is prepared to accept. And the argument essentially inside Downing Street, Boris Johnson's administration, is that look, there are some things that states can't can't accept. They can't. No state accepts a threat to its territorial integrity. That isn't an acceptable step. Now, the obvious response to that is, well, why did you sign the deal? If that's the case, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. So I think what another reading of the situation is that it is an attempt by the Johnson administration to show the EU that they don't have all the cards in this negotiation, and that Britain can inflict costs back onto the EU if it acts in what Britain sees as in an unreasonable manner. In that, essentially, it will not do everything it said it would.
Has this then torpedoed any chance of a deal coming together, or is there still hope that they can come together and get and finalize something before the deadline?
Yeah, there is still hope that they can finalize something. It depends who you talk to, whether you think it's like a sort of 51% chance of a deal or a 49% chance of a deal. But there is definitely hope, and the EU didn't, interestingly, kill off the discussions or the trade discussions when Britain published the text of its proposed bill on Northern Ireland. So that gives you an indication that although they were furious and they said so, they carried on negotiating. So both sides want a deal. Both sides would like to avoid economic disruption. The European Union has an incentive to keep Britain close as possible and to remain as on as friendly terms as possible as well. And that the European Union would prefer if Britain remained in its kind of economic orbit, that its principal trading partner was the EU, not the US, and the UK didn't start adopting radical deregulatory measures to try to outcompete the European Union, because essentially it faced an existential threat if it didn't. So there are lots of incentives for the EU to keep Britain close, but obviously their calculation is perfectly reasonable and correct, that Britain has even more incentives to sign a deal than the European Union does. Britain relies on its trading access to the European Union more than the European Union relies on its trading access to Britain, just because the size going each way is so different. Britain's relationship to the EU is not quite the same as Canada's to the US. Britain is still a big economy, and it buys more EU products than the EU buys British products. But you're still talking in percentage terms. You're talking about a mid-size economy on top of a giant global trading bloc.
All right. Well, Tom, I think that's as good a place as any to leave it. It's hard to say from our perspective here in the U.S. which of our countries will be in better shape at the end of the year, honestly. But stay safe over there, and we'll be rooting for you from this side of the Atlantic.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
Tom McTague is a London-based staff writer for The Atlantic. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow us both on Twitter. My handle is @ElliotWaldman, that's 2 L's, 1 T. Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.